Okay, does the name Louis Vargas mean anything? Anybody? Louis Vargas mean anything to anybody? You know, when the Pope goes to speak out in St. Peter's Basilica, or not in the Basilica, but out in the square, they ring the bells to announce that he's coming out. That's his job. His job is to ring those bells. And a few years ago, he went to ring the bell, pulled the rope, because they do it the old style. Nothing happened. He panics. What do I do? So he goes running up the stairs. And if you've ever seen the bell tower where the Pope speaks there, as it overlooks out of St. Peter's, I mean, those are a lot of steps. He goes running up the steps. He gets up to the top step and he trips. Now the bell is actually stuck back in this position. He hits it with his face. And the bell goes, it comes back, hits him again in the face, knocks him against the wall, and that's how they came up with that statement. They would ask people in Italy, do you know who Louis Vargas is? And they would say no. They would show a picture and they'd say, oh, I don't know the name, but the face rings a bell. Oh, yeah, see, you turn way too quickly. It's just... Okay, I'm going to give you a real name and see if you recognize this. See it? Okay, this is a real name, and then I will tell you the real country and all that stuff. Anders, and then I'm going to probably mispronounce his last name, Bleivik, or Bleivik. I don't know, I think it's Bleivik. Anybody know who that is? Okay, if you were Norwegian, you would know who that is. Because in 2011, he set off a bomb and he killed 8 people in Oslo. Then he went out to an island where a bunch of youth were, dressed as a policeman, and he shot 69 young people. He just went to court again. Okay? How many years do you think he got for that? They don't have the death penalty. 21. That's the maximum they can give him in Norway. 21 years. He went to complain in court. He's in a room with 3 cells, 3 partitions in it. He's got his own bathroom, his own bed, his own Xbox, his own PlayStation, his own, and this is for real. He's got all of that, but he was complaining that he was being mistreated by being in solitary confinement for 22 to 23 years, or 22 to 23 hours out of the day. And he said, I'm being treated as nobody else is. The judge just ruled in his favor, saying that he's being unfairly treated. Nobody else in Norway is being treated this way, and it's not fair to him. And they have to give him more time with people, more access to the internet, etc., etc. He did lose part of another case that he brought against him, but that one he won. And I thought, how in the world have we gotten to that stage to where we say this guy's life is more important than the 77 people that he managed to kill? How did we get to this stage? You know, in Norway, and I said they are more progressive than we are, than any other country, because they looked at rehabilitation of this man. And I thought, this is the guy that gave the Nazi salute when they brought him into court. He admitted that he killed them all and said that he wanted to start a riot and wanted to make sure that the Islam would not take over his country, and that was his motivation for killing all the young people. And I'm thinking, how did we get to saying, well, let's rehabilitate him because we want to make sure that he feels good about himself and all of those things? And I think it is because we have lost this concept right here, namely that we are all sinners. We want to believe we're all good people, and we're really all basically good. and we're just going to rehabilitate them. When I was a kid, they called them penal colonies because they were penalizing them for doing something. They are now called correctional facilities. Very subtle difference, but it is our philosophy. We're going to rehabilitate them because basically we're all good people. Just ask Uncle Adolf. Okay? And I think it is because we've lost sight of, and the part we don't want to admit, we're all sinners. And so that's what we're going to look at this morning. We're just going through the book of Romans. That's where we ended up. And in Romans 3, verses 10 through 12 says this, "As it is written, there is none righteous, not even one. There is none who understands. There is none who seeks for God. They have all turned aside. Together they have become useless. There is none who does good. There is not even one." And what Paul is quoting here is Psalm 14. Then he goes on and quotes a whole bunch of other psalms in there. But he's saying, you know what, we're all sinners. Now, we don't like to admit we're sinners. We want to believe we're all good. Part of that is true. We've been created in the image of God. That is the good part of us. But the bad part is we're all sinners. And we're sinners two ways. Number one, by nature. And number two, by our actions. And we're going to look at that this morning. Our nature and our actions as sinners. Now, like I said, I don't like to admit I'm a sinner. None of us likes to admit that. When I became a Christian as a young man in Keflavik, Iceland, in the Navy, the hardest part for me was to admit that I was a sinner. Because I looked around in the Navy and I could actually find some really pretty good sinners. There's a guy that is hugging the porcelain king nearly every night. That means he's throwing up in the toilet. Okay? Because he's getting so drunk he's doing it. There's a guy, oh, he's burning incense. You know why he's burning incense? He's covering the other stuff that he's smoking. There's a guy over there that every time we go to a new base, and I moved to a lot of bases when I was in the Navy. Let's see, I was at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 bases, I think, I was at in 4 years. But every time we went to a base as a squadron, he was with a different woman. That guy is a sinner. Me? I don't do any of those. But you see, I had other sin in my life. Pride, arrogance, all those things that we want to baptize and make them spiritually okay. And here it says that God looks down from heaven and there's not anybody doing everything he wants him to do or her to do. There's none who seeks after God. There is none righteous. They've all turned aside and become useless. That's difficult for us to accept. So how did we get that way? Number one, we're born that way. We're born in with a sin nature. You say, Jerry, how do you know that? Well, a little later in Romans 5, verse 12, it reads this. Therefore, just as through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned. It says there that we have a tendency, it's like in our DNA. Now you can't go find something in the in your DNA, in your double helix, that says that, oh, here we found it, and this is the sinner part of us. But it said when Adam chose to sin, and by the way, that word man there is not the word for male, it's the word anthropos, meaning mankind. Adam and Eve. You stop and think about it. God started with just one command. Don't eat out of that tree. Not an apple tree, by the way. Just don't. That's all I had to do, just obey one command. Then with Moses, he gives it to 10. They forget trying to keep the 10 commandments. They couldn't keep the one. And so what happens? They eat. Sin enters their personality. They've never sinned before. Now they have sin as part of their lives. And that begins to spread to everybody else. And we all carry that characteristic of sin by our very nature. That's who we are. We're sinners at our very core. Matter of fact, you go on 7 more verses later in this, and in Romans 5:19 it says, "For as through the one man's disobedience, the many were made sinners." And we became sinners. Then the last part of the verse, "Even so, through the obedience of the one," that would be Jesus, "the many will be made righteous." That Jesus is the one that makes us right. We're all sinners. Like I said, we don't like to admit we're sinners. We want to find somebody else to be a sinner, but not us. After all, we're Christians. And we're spiritual, so we don't sin anymore. David says this 1,000 years before what we just read. Psalm 51, verse 5. "Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin my mother conceived me." That doesn't mean she was an immoral person. Doesn't mean that having sex is sinful, which some churches manage to teach, that that's a sinful thing to do. That's not true. He's saying, man, when I was born as a sinner. That's just the way I started out. Did you ever notice you don't have to teach a child to sin? Okay, now be selfish and say mine. We didn't have to be taught to do that. We just naturally did it. And when a kid gets in trouble, they always tell you the truth. Because we did when we were kids. Right? We always told the truth. No, you've got to beat that. I mean, you have to get the child corrected in such a way that they learn. You can't do that. We don't have to teach people how to sin. That comes naturally to us. We are, in fact, sinful and sinners. In 1 John 1:9, or 1:8, excuse me, 1:9 is the one we always use. 1:8 is the preceding one, and it says, "If we say that we have no sin, we're deceiving ourselves, and the truth is not in us." If we say, I don't have any sin. I have met 2 people in the world who told me they had never sinned. 2. Okay? The first time I'd ever heard of it, actually, I was the assistant pastor of a church back in Colorado. Andy was the pastor, and he was telling me that he had a deacon in his church, and that deacon said, "Andy, we'd like for you to come out. My wife and I have something that we want to talk to you about." And it was off of this verse, "All have sinned and come short of the glory of God." And they sat down and they said, "Andy, we know that that's in the Bible. We know that that's true. But my wife and I were looking at this, and we could not think of a time she had ever sinned." And Andy said, "Well, that's one right there." Okay? The 2 that I knew, both of them said, they had never sinned and all that stuff. So I just took them back and I said, well, let's look at the 10 Commandments. And I said, the very first one is that you take the Lord's name, never take his name in vain. Have you ever used the, oh, well, yeah. Okay, that's it, there's one. And I went down and took them through all 10 and they said, well, those aren't sins, those are just, oops. Those are just a mistake. You see, and what I found out later is they were both alcoholics and didn't want to face the fact that they had sin in their life. Okay? If we say we have no sin, the only person we're fooling is ourselves. Okay? It very simply says that the truth is not in us. But today's society, we don't want to talk about sin. I thought about, do I want to preach the sermon or not? Because we don't like the idea that we're sinners. We're on this end of the pendulum where we don't want to talk about the sinfulness of ourselves. And I think the reason is because then we have to admit, if we are sinners, that makes me one. And I don't want to admit that I am. And so we'll just talk about how good we are instead. And so we'll just talk about how we correct ourselves and become better people and all of that. Instead of saying, wow, We are in fact sinners. Why do we do that? I think that answer really is found in Jeremiah 17:9, which says, "The heart is more deceitful than all else and is desperately sick. Who can understand it?" You know, our heart deceives us. We will convince ourselves certain things are true no matter what. And the most important one is, that wasn't a sin. We deceive ourselves on the fact that we're deceitful in our heart. It's one of those circuitous type things. I don't want to admit that I deceive myself, but I do. And the fact that I don't want to admit I am a sinner by my very nature, and I don't want to see it. I'll give you one. I was in college. I worked in the math department. There was the professor that I had, godly woman. She's the head of the math department, neat lady. And I overheard her one time talking to this other person. And he said, "Why does Jerry always fly off the handle like that?" And she said, "Oh, he just does that all the time." Whoa. I wanted to say, well, I've got a reason to do that. You know what the reason is? I'm a sinner. And I need to knock that off. I need to stop doing that. And that leads us to the second part. Sin by our actions. Okay, I'm a sinner by nature. My DNA says I'm a sinful person. Now, the activity part of it. Jesus talking to the Pharisees and a bunch of people, and they were getting on to him by what he was eating. And what they were, and Jesus says, it's not what goes into you, it's what comes out of you that. And they say, what are you talking about? And he says this, Matthew 15:18-19. But the things that proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, and those defile the man. For out of the heart comes evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, slanders. He said, you know, it comes right out of our character, and it comes out our mouth. Have you ever said anything you wish you hadn't said? Those evil thoughts, boom, it is out of your mouth before you even know what to say. We all need to pray that prayer. Lord, make my words sweet, kind, and gentle, for later I may have to eat them. Okay? Man, the thought, evil thought, man, out it comes. And I've said things that I said, oh man, why did I say that? It's because it comes out of my heart. The interesting thing is the things that he adds. Murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, those come out of the heart, come out the mouth, it says. Fascinating. That's what comes out of our very character. And then he adds those other two, false witness, which means you're saying something that's not true. Slander means you're saying something that is true, but it derides the character of the other person. Okay? Now that's not how we use slander today. Slander is when it's not true. But back here it meant simply to speak down against someone, true or not true. And so it says that comes out of us. So how does that work? I'm sinful on the inside, so why does it come out? Maybe I should be Flip Wilson, for those that are older. The devil made me do it. It's not me, it's the devil. The devil made me buy that dress. Okay? But in James it talks about, you know how this really works? It works this way. But each one is tempted when he's carried away and enticed by his own lust. Then when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death. So it says, here's the little system. All of us have within us certain desires in our life. And then a temptation comes along, and that entices us. And then, because we desire it and the entire enticement is there, it becomes a temptation for us. What's a temptation for you may not be a temptation for me. What's a temptation for me may not be a temptation for you at all. For instance, some people, there's a $100 bill laying there. For some people, it is all they can do to not take that $100 bill. For other people, they walk by and go, so. And it's because inside of me, that's not one of my desires to be rich. It's not important to me. There's no temptation. I'm not even enticed by that. But somebody else, they're going to be. You get caught doing something embarrassing. Some people will just fess right up. I did that. Others have the temptation, I got to save face because I don't have much left, that I need to protect it at all points, and so I will tell something that's not true. The temptation is there to lie. And it says we all face different temptations in our lives, and we all have different desires. When that desire matches up with the temptation that's there and the enticement to do it, and we go do it, it's just like it suddenly becomes sin. And sin yields death. But it is internal that I fight this battle right here, just like you do. Every one of us. And the question is, who wins? Way too many times, I lose because I win. Meaning I do what I know I'm not supposed to do. You say, well, yeah, but I pretty well eradicated those. We'll get you on one more here. Okay? James 4:17. You go a little further, and it says this. Therefore, to one who knows to do the right thing to do, and does not do it, to him it is sin. Now, if you happen to have a King James Version, it says the one that knows to do good. And that's really a better translation. This word is good. And it says, you know the good thing to do and you choose not to do it. That's sin also. Ooh. We went from a sin of commission, I committed that sin, to a sin of omission, I omitted to do the right thing. And there's a whole big theological study of sins of commission, sins of omission, etc., etc. But you know, that means that I sin by not doing the thing that I know I should have done, just as much as by doing the things that I wasn't supposed to do that I did do. And so I can have sin of doing something or not doing something. Man, I am a sinner. It's in my DNA, if you will. It is in my character, and I haul off and I do it on top of it. And so what we're going to do this morning, we're going to have everybody come up here and confess their sins right here. And Judy's sitting here, so we'll pick her first. And she's going, no, you don't. You know, it's Charlie's job, Debbie. You know, we don't want to admit that's our sin, that we're sinful. And I'm sure not going to get up and confess it in front of you guys, because after all, being the pastor, I need to be last. And, it's okay? Man, I don't want to admit that. But I'm a sinner through and through. I have the sin nature, and I commit sin. And I omit to do the wrong thing, so I sin that way as well. That's my character. So where does that leave me? Well, next week, I'll preach on... No, I won't do that to you. Actually, next week does follow this one. But there's a great verse, and then we'll talk about that. It's found in 2 Corinthians 5:21. Now that we recognize we're really sinners, 2 Corinthians 5:21 says this. He, God, made him, Jesus, who knew no sin, to be sin on our behalf, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. I am the sinner. Jesus is not. He dies on the cross for me. He takes all my sinnerness, I just made that word up, all my sinnerness out of me, the fact that I am a sinner. And he takes all of that to himself. He takes all of his righteousness that he lived his life perfectly, and he places that upon me. And we've exchanged places. You know those movies where somebody always mysteriously changes places with their teenage daughter, son, whatever, usually a teenage daughter, and they do those kinds of things. That's all wonderful theory, but this is true. I am righteous in the sight of God because of Jesus Christ in my life. Isn't that incredible? So you say, okay, Jerry, so why did you preach the sermon anyway? You know, you made us all sinners. We all are. We recognize that. Now, why did you preach that? 3 reasons. Number 1, it's a mystery. Is because I need to recognize who I really am. You know, this really is who I am. I am, in fact, a sinner. The first step of receiving Jesus Christ is recognizing your need for him. The other thing is, and I'm going to slaughter the Latin, so all you Latin people just wince quietly. Martin Luther said, simul justus et peccator, meaning, while justified, yet a sinner, an offender. I have become a Christian. I am seen as righteous in the eyes of God, but I'm still a sinner. I'd love to tell you that I'm perfect and I don't sin. I only tell my wife that. She doesn't believe me either. Okay? I'm still a sinner. If I believed that you had to be perfect after you became a Christian, I would just hold you down when I baptize you, because you're not going to make it. Just like I'm not. We are all still sinners. I need to recognize who I am. Why do I need to do that? It's number 2. It keeps me from becoming a Pharisee. The Pharisees saw themselves as righteous, and everybody else who wasn't like them as sinners. And in fact, they called them sinners. They consistently get on Jesus. Why does he eat with sinners? All those people who are not like me. Because after all, I have arrived. See, that goes back to that first one. I need to recognize that I am a sinner, and I need to stop doing that to everybody else. It is so easy to point out everybody else's sin. Oh yeah, that's easy. What about me? That's what the Pharisees could do. They could point out everybody else's sin. And number 3, I need to see the magnitude of God's grace to me. I do not deserve salvation. God gives it to me. So when I stand back, I just go, wow, Jesus did that for me. There are 2 kinds of people in the world. There are those who believe there are 2 kinds of people, and there are those who believe that there aren't 2 kinds of people. Okay? That's not true. Well, it is true, but that's not the point. There are 2 kinds of people in the world. There are sinners who've been saved by grace and forgiven. There are sinners who have not experienced God's grace and are going to carry that for eternity. That's it. Everybody on this planet is a sinner. I've been fortunate enough to receive God's grace. I have received the grace of God. Jesus came to die for every one of those, Now the question is, what will they do with Jesus? I'm a sinner, but I'm a forgiven sinner. There are other sinners who have never received Jesus, and they're unforgiven. But we're all sinners. So when we deal with people around us, Chuck Colson used to go to prisons and speak after he got out of prison. And Chuck Colson would start off this way: "Hello, sinner." And the reason he started is, he said they knew they were. You see, we have a tendency to think we're not. And we need to recognize we are. Then there are those, like I said, the hardest part was for God to convince me I was a sinner and I needed a Savior. When I gave my life to Jesus, I recognized He died for me. Not just out there in theory, but for me. And I was, in fact, a sinner who needed forgiveness. I had a pastor friend of mine who was up at Lake Tahoe. He was on the opposite extreme. He had been a professional piano player. He played backup for a guy named Little Richard. We're not talking he was pretty good. We're talking he was really good. And he played, and he started naming all these people. That's the one that stuck in my mind. Started naming all these people. And he said, "Jerry, I played backup for every one of those." He said, "Let me tell you, those things they tell you about the band people, the drugs, the sex, all the crazy stuff that goes on." He said, "Every bit of that is true." He says, "I know. I did it." He said he got married. His wife couldn't stand that kind of lifestyle. She started going to church. She found Christ. He went to church. But he sat there and goes, "God, I am such a mess. There's no way you could forgive me of this." Finally, he gave the invitation. We're going to have one next Sunday. Gives the invitation. This guy says, "Man, I just felt like something was compelling me to go down there." Said, "I came down." And he said, looked at him and grabbed the pastor and says, "But I think I'm too great, I'm too far gone, too great of a sinner." He said, "Let me take you to one verse." And that verse is, "For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God." Next one. He says, are you a sinner?" He says, "Yes, but I'm too much." He says, "That's not the question. Are you one of those sinners?" He said, "Yes." "Let me take you one more verse. But the gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ." He says, all you have to do is receive Him. Man, I don't recognize the depth of grace that God has given me that makes me right with Him. So, hello, sinners. I'm one too. The reason Chuck Colson could say that to him, he had been in prison. He knew he was, and they knew he was in prison also. We're all sinners. And what I want you to do is to go, you know what? 2 things, 3 things. Number 1, that's who I am. Number 2, so don't get too uppity. Okay? Number 2, don't start finding everybody else's sin. The news media will do that for you and point it out. Don't become a Pharisee. And number 3, aren't you glad you've experienced the grace of God? What depth that is. That He would put that upon me, upon you. Let's pray. Father, here's your sinful congregation, all of us together. Thank you for seeing us as righteous in Jesus Christ. Father, we're sinners because there's nobody else on this earth but us sinners. Lord, thank you that you sent your Son Jesus. We're amazed, absolutely amazed that you would do that. Lord, we always want to quantify our sin as not as bad as the next guy. Father, we are sinners. But we're your sinners. And we're your forgiven people. Lord, help us this week as we look around to see sinful people around us. Some doing some very sinful things. But they need your Son Jesus. Lord, help us to not become Pharisees. And most of all, help us to really recognize what you did when you took all the sins of the world, all of them, there on that cross, and exchanged your life for ours. Oh, the depth of your grace. We stand amazed.